Hi, this is Corey Jensen, again with a new weekly topic for Utah's historic architecture. And today we are going to be talking about, again, another housing type that features two rooms, and that is the double cell or double penthouse. If you'll remember, in an earlier episode, we had discussed the single cell or single penthouse type, and this was the simplest housing type in the state early on, being comprised of, as the name suggests, a single room for the main body of the house. Then we described the two-room hall parlor house type, and this was perhaps the most common type found in Utah. As you'll recall, this is a one-room extension of the single cell, not quite a full square room, but a portion of a square, being slightly smaller than the main hall room, hence the name hall parlor. So in this episode, we're going to take that a step further, and in the double cell, we're talking about a house with two equally sized square or rectangular rooms. So like the hall parlor, the double cell, as the term implies, is another form of two-room housing, usually slightly longer than the hall parlor. This type has two equally sized rooms, as I mentioned, within the main body of the structure. The rooms are typically square or nearly square, since early builders didn't really have tape measures or exact measurements to work with. The dividing wall could hold a double fireplace or a stove flue with a connection in each room, and then a doorway to access both rooms. The fireplace or stove could also be located on the end walls, such as we talked about for the hall parlor. On the exterior, the double cell is fairly easy to distinguish. With the center chimney version, the double cell's chimney is directly in the middle of the roof, as opposed to an off-center chimney, as is found on the hall parlor plan. Like the hall parlor, the main facade of the double cell is almost always on the broad side, with the roof line parallel to the street, and it can either be 1.5, or 2 stories tall. But as we describe these houses, we are only talking about the layout of the main floor. The difference between the two on the primary facade lies in the fenestration pattern, or the door and window openings. Where the hall parlor usually has an odd number of openings on the main facade, 3 or 5 bays, symmetrically balanced with a centrally placed door, what we call bilateral symmetry. The double cell has an even number of openings, typically 4 or 6 across. Because the dividing wall is in the direct center of the building, there can't be a door there, so the openings need to be on either side of the center. There may be a single doorway placed on one side of the center, or 2 doorways placed on either side of center as well. With the 4-bay facade, the double entries are usually the centermost openings, while the 6-bay facade, the entries are typically centered between a pair of flanking windows, which provides the effect of a double house. But there are a variety of fenestration patterns in double cells, and we'll see a few of those in a minute. Again, this is all based on the earlier influence of classicism in architecture, the time that the state was being settled. Symmetry was key in classically influenced architecture. If there was no other classical architectural elements on the house from this era, at least the bilateral symmetry would give it away as some type of classical housing, very square and very lacking in detail and more or less austere. So when one sees an early house in Utah with 2 front doors, what do they automatically assume? That it's a polygamous house, of course. Herein lies one of the common misconceptions of the double cell, that they were designed in Utah as polygamous housing. Because of the double entryways, and of course because of local folklore, many assume that all double cells house multiple wives of polygamous males. This would seem an obvious assumption, except for the fact that double cell type dwellings are commonly found in the mid-Atlantic states, the South and Midwestern United States as well. The multiple entries provided balance and symmetry in the fenestration at a time when classical ideology played an important part of the architectural design. Also, many double cells were the result of a full addition constructed at the end of a single cell. This usually occurred when the family size and wealth increased. And we'll see an example or two of that as well. Many a local myth has been debunked when research has revealed on a particular house that none of the early inhabitants were actually polygamous. However, this is not to say that no double cell dwellings house polygamous families. Quite the opposite. This could be correctly assumed that double doorways made for convenience and privacy in housing multiple families. So, depending on the community, chances are that this type of dwelling could have been used to house multiple spouses. Other than for symmetry or potentially housing polygamous families, why else do you think would a house have two front doors? Well, perhaps just for convenience of separate outside entrances for each room, or for airflow in warmer climates, such as the Creole house types found in Louisiana, which have almost full length windows and two front doors on them in most cases that could be opened up to allow for better airflow. There are several hundred examples of double cell houses found in the Utah Historic Buildings database at the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. But there are likely many more undocumented examples of double cell dwellings throughout the state. So, right now, we're going to take a look at some examples. In our previous discussion on single cell houses, I noted that it was uncommon, or not uncommon, for this type to receive additions as the owners had the means to expand their house. This is an example that's found in Orem that actually started out as a double cell, and I've drawn a little dotted line to kind of show the division. This house was built actually early 20th century, around 1905, and then a few years later, a second cell was added to it to make it a complete double cell. This one's kind of an interesting layout where you have both doors into each cell on the right and both windows on the left. It's typically not that way. But nonetheless, this is a very late example of a single cell that was then doubled to a double cell. These are two examples at different ends of the state. The upper house in this photo is a very simple double cell located in Santa Clara down in Washington County. Prior to it being moved to Santa Clara, it was located in the mining community of Silver Reef. So it was built mid to late 19th century, and then it was moved to its location in Santa Clara in the early decades of the 20th century. What's interesting about this is the clapboards on the front. Typically, you don't see clapboard siding in Utah, probably because this was built in a mining community where lumber construction was quicker and easier to build for mostly expedient housing, is why it had the clapboard front. Interestingly, on the sides of this in the back, it's board and batten siding. But as you see, this is more of a typical layout with the two doors into each cell in the middle part, and then the windows on the outside parts of the facade. The lower example is from Mendon up in Cache County. And this is a little more substantial building constructed of local stone. And this one has the two three-bay facades on the front, making it look like two individual houses. However, this was not a polygamous house. George Washington Baker was not a polygamist, and he just built this house for whatever reason. Here's another interesting example in Spring City in Sanpete County. Again, this one has the double three-bay facades, or 6 bays across, with the two doors flanked by two windows each. I don't know if you can see it that well, but what's interesting about this and why I included it is the finish of the exterior walls. This was actually a adobe brick building, which was then covered in stucco, which was then etched and painted to look like brick, thereby heightening the classical look of this, along with the pedimented window heads that were typical of Greek Revival architecture. I found a photo of it from a more recent Google Street View around 2015. You can see the house has actually been restored compared to the early 1980s photograph on the top. So a great save of a historic building in Utah. Again, this example is from Sanpete County and Manti. Most of these are going to be from Sanpete County that I'll be showing you today. This is the Francis Jolly House. This is a brick example that looks almost more like it's from the Panguitch um, down in Wayne County area. There are several houses with this similar, very short Gothic revival example of dormered windows on the front. And so this is unique. What's also somewhat unique about it is that even though it is a double cell, you can see that it has 4 bays across, it only has one door. So only one side has an entryway into it, whereas the other one has windows. This one also has interesting brick. It's a little more red than you typically find in Sanpete County. And judging from the date, around 1870, there was not a lot of fired brick available then. So it's possible that this brick was made and then shipped in to build this house. It's also possible that the brick came from a different area of Sanpete County, perhaps Wales, that has a little bit different clay color than you find in other parts of northern Utah and Sanpete County. So here's one. This is the Cox Shoemaker Perry house. Again, this one's in Manti. And this one underwent a series of changes. And a couple of drawings on the left of the slide here, you can see compared to the actual building on the right. This one received a couple of major remodelings early on. It was first built by Jezreel Shoemaker, who served as the mayor of Manti. A few years later, it was acquired by Edward L. Perry, a stonemason who had immigrated from Wales. The first major remodeling of the home was probably accomplished around 1880 by Perry, the chief mason for the Manti LDS temple that was being constructed at the time. He was responsible for adding a stone room to the north end of the house, which you really can't see in this photo at the rear. But he also added the classical styled porch on the front. Also at this time, a central passageway and staircase. The original closet type staircase was located along the back wall of the south front room. This was changed to a central passageway that was inserted into the center of the house. And this required restructuring of the facade to more of an asymmetrical configuration. So you can see in the top drawing that it had on the main floor 2 3-bay type facade with 6 openings across the front. But as that interior was changed to rearrange the staircase and the use of the rooms, the central door on the right was actually changed to a window. And the window on top, the second from the left, was changed to a door, which accessed the porch roof, which was later added. So study in the area reveals that the central passageway idea, while obviously an option here from the time of the first settlement in 1849, was employed really only sparingly until the 1880s, when most larger homes, which were usually built of brick or stone, contained a center passageway or a separate hallway, and we'll talk about that in a separate episode. At this time, several houses, including the Cox Shoemaker Perry house, underwent fashionable center passageway alterations. Internal considerations were outweighed by the concern for maintaining a balanced symmetry at this point, as picturesque styles started to come more into fashion and leave away, I guess, the more austere classical symmetry. So this is a very interesting house in Manti. A house that is almost right next door to it is what's known as the Cox family big house. Technically, this is known as a double pile house because it's more than one room deep. It has 2 rooms deep on it, but the front or west-facing rooms are set up in a double cell fashion. As you can see in this photo, there's a window, and then a window pattern across the front, and a center dividing wall. The rear rooms of this are set up more in the center passage where you have 2 rooms on either end and then a hallway separating the 2. This is recognized as Manti's only example of a residence specifically designed for multiple wives and extended polygamous family. Because of that, what we call the double pile plan, based more on a Georgian plan, it allowed for more room in there for the families. The house was constructed over the course of 7 years between 1854 and 1861. The big house was designed to house separate family units and also provide a space for communal social and educational activities, mostly on the top floor. Five of Frederick Walter Cox's six wives lived in the house. These were Emmeline Whiting Cox, Jemima Losey Cox, Cordelia Morley Cox, Lydia Margaret Losey Cox, and Emma Sophia Peterson Cox. As documented by primary and secondary sources, the main floor of the house was divided into four sections, each assigned to four of the older wives. The youngest wife, Emma, briefly shared one of the quarters before having a small stone house built next door, and that is still there. In fact, the two houses were actually just recently listed in the National Register of Historic Places. So again, the two Cox houses, which are almost next door to each other, are fairly large examples of double cell houses. Only one of them, though, was used for a polygamous family. So for this final slide, I also wanted to show a couple of polygamous houses. These are two double cell houses that belonged to the wives of Robert Gardner, who was my great-great-grandfather. These were built in the small town of Pine Valley, north of St. George, up in the mountains, the Pine Valley Mountains. He moved three of his wives up there in the 1860s and built two houses that were very similar to each other. These two, the upper one was for for Jane Gardner, and the bottom one was for Cynthia Gardner. They were fairly identical in plan, although slightly different with the rear addition. But they had the outside windows on the facade with the interior doors, and then a porch located across the front. The upper one, the Cynthia Gardner house, has some minor Greek Revival details on it with the coin or with the cornice returns and then the Italianate brackets across the front. Jane Gardner's house underwent some changes in the 1940s, and the original siding, which had been covered with asphalt brick siding, was then removed and these larger clapboards put on, as well as a newer front porch. However, you can still see the Greek Revival cornice returns on the side, as well as the triangular window pediments that denote the Greek Revival style. What's also interesting about these, we talked earlier about the double cell was not a house type that was actually designed in Utah for polygamous families. However, it could have been used for polygamous families because of the two separate entrances. These houses were for polygamous wives, but each house had its own single family in it. So they weren't shared wives in a single house. Each wife had all of her children in one house. So the two front doors were added more for the sake of symmetry and for convenience than they were for the polygamous use. Unfortunately, the top one, the Cynthia Gardner house, has recently been demolished, but the Jane Gardner house is still standing. So with that, I hope you have learned something interesting today and learned more about early housing in Utah. And now you can wow your friends with the knowledge you've gained. And we'll talk about a new housing type next time on Utah's Historic Architecture. Thanks.